We all know that reading is one of the best things you can do if you want to learn another language, but finding the right book can be tricky. I've said this many times, but there are two features you need to look for in reading material for learning another language. It should be easy enough to understand, but at the same time, interesting enough to hold your attention. In educational terms, we call that comprehensible and compelling. So it's natural to ask ourselves, should I read a children's book in my target language? And of course, the answer to that question is yes, you absolutely should. And the other answer to that question is no, don't waste your time. Kids' books are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they have pictures and simple vocabulary, and that helps a lot in the comprehensible department. And usually, the stories in children's books can be kind of charming and entertaining enough to hold your attention for at least a little while. On the other hand, children's books are still designed for native speakers, which you are not. A lot of times, they use colloquial language, and they're on topics that might not be the most useful to a language learner right up front. And they're almost never interesting enough to compel you to want to keep reading. Like, man, I stayed up till 2 a.m. last night because I couldn't put down the new Berenstain Bears book. Really sucked me in. So kids' books can work if you've got nothing else to read, but they're not ideal. There are challenges unique to adult language learners that child native speakers just don't face. And the best language learning books are designed to address those specific challenges. But maybe you're learning a language that doesn't have many learning resources. You might have to resort to children's books. Then you'll have to do what I did with Malik Kelot when I started learning Thai. I put in a lot of work to transform this children's book into a language learning book for intensive reading. I hired a tutor to go through the book with me and make a little glossary of words that I didn't know on each page. I also went on Reddit and I found a native speaker who was willing to send me an MP3 of herself narrating the book. And the whole time I was thinking, you know, it would be really nice if some language learning company just did all this work for me. So I made my own language learning book series, and if you happen to be learning one of these languages, then you can just buy the book that I designed for language learners. But if not, there's a few steps you can take to transform most children's books into more effective language learning resources, like I did. Now, pictures are really useful to help you understand what's going on in the story, so I included a bunch of pictures in my book, just like in most kids' books. I also included a bunch of features that most kids' books don't have, like vocabulary lists, comprehension questions, and note sections, in case you wanted to take notes while you go over the story with a tutor. And that's all stuff that you can just add to an ordinary children's book if you sit down with a native speaker who's willing to help. But probably the most important feature of my language learning series is that each book has 3 distinct levels, so it grows with you as you improve from beginner to intermediate. The beginner level is narrated 2 separate times, and this is something that I recommend doing even if you're trying to learn with children's books. Hire a native speaker to record themselves reading the story 2 times. Once in a clear, slow voice so you can distinctly hear each word as it's pronounced, and then one more time in a more natural conversational voice so you can get used to hearing how native speakers actually talk. Then the second and third levels get progressively more advanced. They're the same story as the beginner level, but the plot gets more in-depth and more interesting. This way you always have somewhere to advance to, rather than a children's book where you just finish the story and then you have to start from scratch with a new book. And unfortunately, I don't really see any way of emulating that if you're trying to learn with children's books, so I guess that's just a limitation of that method. After you read through a few of these books and your language is starting to become more intermediate, another great step is to start reading anything by Ollie Richards. He's published quite a few books of short stories and conversations that are more appropriate for intermediate to advanced learners, and some other more informational books on topics that matter, written in simple language for the benefit of language learners. So I'm gonna leave a link to his Amazon page in the description below. And if you're interested in purchasing any of my beginner books, you can do so here. Now go into the world and learn that language.